sex work and the question of how the South African legal system should respond to it and related activities has been a subject of debate for a while now. Government is now calling for public comment on changes that seek to decriminalise sex work. How big a step is this in terms of asserting the rights of sex workers? Well, we're joined now by Megan Lessing from the Sex Workers Education and Advocacy Taskforce, also known as SWET. Megan, thank you so much for your time this morning. A very good morning to you. I think the biggest conversation that even you and I have had on an ongoing basis regarding some of the realities that are being faced by sex workers is how they find themselves in danger. They're in danger on behalf of those that are consuming, right, the clients. They're in danger from law enforcement because they end up being taken for granted. But are we actually casting a spotlight to what it means to have a sex work criminalized at this current juncture in the South African context, and what it would mean to decriminalize it?
Definitely, like you said, it's a huge first step. I think in the summary, the minister kind of put it all together that the position to decriminalize sex work is mainly taken to protect sex workers. I mean, we cannot deny. I think that the government have already looked at, the violence that sex workers face. They've made a policy position in terms of the NSP to put it there under Pillar 3 to say that to decriminalize sex work is a tool to address gender-based violence in this country. Similarly, in the NSP on HIV, to decriminalize sex work is a tool to address the HIV rate, especially among women sex workers. So yes, it is.
Well, as you're speaking about how it's definitely a move to protect sex workers, but why don't we speak enough about the legalization of it? And I don't understand from the premise of everything works with supply and demand. There would not be a supply had there not been a demand. Are we hypocritically conservative in our approach to sex work to a point where we're comfortable enough of having these conversations around decriminalization now? But when are we going to have conversations about legalization?
So, to be honest, we do not want sex work to be legalized. There is, in the sex work industry, there is a significant difference between decriminalization and legalization. So, a country where sex work has been legalized is a country like the Netherlands. But what happens under legalization is such heavy regulation that your sex workers almost becomes the ownership is given over to government. The regulation around, decisions about your body, where you can do sex work, how. So that is the issues that we have with legalization. So we advocate for decriminalization. We are very happy to have these discussions around decriminalization as to what it means. It simply means that sex work is work and that sex workers deserve protection like any other citizen in this country. And they also have the same rights and responsibilities as any other person in this country.
It's an age-old conversation around the decriminalization element of it. But in recent reports, we had one woman believed to be a sex worker that was found in a panel beating shop amongst other 6 bodies or so. And a 21-year-old or 20-year-old is now in custody of that regard. When it comes to the decriminalizing, are we hoping that there will not be a target of, for example, human trafficking? And how do we stop them from being a target of human trafficking? How do we stop them from being targeted by, dangerous people that want to just take advantage of perhaps the industry?
So sex workers face extremely high levels of violence, and they face that violence under criminalization currently. They face it because that legal model, criminalizing, makes it extensively easier for sex workers drives them underground. Like you said, the man currently in custody is for the murder of one sex worker, but we all know that there are 5 other bodies still needing to be identified. And that happened under criminalization. We should be very careful not to conflate consensual adult sex work with human trafficking, because human trafficking is a gross human rights violation. It should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. But there is a current law that deals with human trafficking. If we conflate, because human trafficking is not unique to the sex work industry. It is not unique to women. So anybody can be, any industry can be victim to trafficking. So we should be careful not to conflate those. And of course, the current violence that happens to sex workers has happened inside a criminalized industry. So we're hoping that, that decriminalization would contribute to more safety environments for sex workers, but also address the stigma that the sex workers face.
Let's talk a little bit about the stigma. How prevalent is it? And then again, my mind struggles with this notion of sex work being still highly stigmatized, when the reason why the industry is worth the amount that it is, I think it's worth like, what, billions or so. It's because there's a supply and there's a demand, and yet we insist on being conservative about it and stigmatizing those that are within the industry. How rife is the stigma, and does it actually make sense at this time?
Yeah, people often don't want to talk about demand because I think there is a tendency to take a lot of responsibility, and it's often connected to morality on women. So, that demand aspect is never addressed. But also, in terms of the impact of stigma, the impact of stigma is pervasive. Stigma kills. We talked about the women's bodies that were found in various stages of decomposition in Johannesburg, and there's been no outrage, and that means that 6 women went missing, and we offered no least that 3 were reported missing, and there was no media coverage of 3 women from a certain area being missing, because there was an understanding that these women were sex workers, and because they're stigmatized, their lives simply don't matter. And that's why them being missing or them being murdered is no more, it's nothing of importance, because it's not, it's what people call, they're not easy victims, So those are the things that we know for sure. And this is why I say, the research that shows that stigma, in fact, kills.
Yeah, stigma kills.
It does many other things. Yeah,
yeah, and I worry, Megan, that stigma on behalf of the sex worker, it kills, but we always focus the conversation on the sex worker. That's where the spotlight is always. But we never speak about the individual that purchases sex, right? Because that's in essence where it all begins, right? There's the individual that actually wants to purchase sex, and then never mind the fact that there is the sex worker, but the spotlight is always cast on what is happening on behalf of the sex worker. But we never speak about that person, that guy or that girl who believes that, let us purchase sex. How dangerous is it, though, to perpetuate the stigma that we'd never have the conversation about the person that is actually buying sex?
Well, of course, in a criminalized context, you would have to have decision, or at least a conversation on the client, because under this law, both the sex worker and the client is considered criminals under this law. But yeah, like I said, often that there's not much focus on the client, because you put a lot more responsibility on women. There is often a tendency to pathologize the decision to do sex work, but we have to understand that first and foremost, sex work is it's an income. It's being done for the money. So, in terms of clients, even the way that we know that the law that is, the law that currently criminalizes sex work, is such a difficult and such a arbitrary law to prosecute under, and this is why sex work is primarily policed under municipal bylaws. It's a law difficult to prove. So even then, because sex workers are harassed and violated and extorted on the streets, you can almost understand how they become the target. They become the target because they are more vulnerable, because most often they are women. They become the target because they are exposed on the streets. They are at the mercy of often a police force that can kind of twist the laws to fit a narrative, depending on what they want: physical violence, sexual violence, if they want money. So those are the things that happen. So because there's not much space to talk about a client, I want to also say this in terms of clients deserve the right to be able to purchase consensual sex, pay for a service, have sex, and then pay for a service, So there is also, to some extent, in decriminalizing sex work, the right for people to make decisions, Sometimes people want to have sex, and they want to have sex with some level of anonymity.
Megan, it certainly is going to be a conversation that never ends now, especially as we're talking about how, the strategies towards the decriminalisation element of sex work, but it just becomes profound. Why is it that we found ourselves with a highly conservative conversation? Meanwhile, this is the reality that we're facing on the ground. But we'll leave it there for now. Megan Lessing is from the Sex Workers Education and Advocacy Taskforce, and also known as SWEAT. Well, let's go.